I've recently become a big fan of one-by drivetrains. For me, they solve a problem that I don't hear people talk about a lot, but that you might have as well. This is my giant Contend. It's a 2x, so it's got a 3450 up front and an 11 to 32 in the rear. When riding at my preferred cadence and average speed, I'm frequently in the 3411 position. It's really not ideal. I can actually hear the chain rubbing along the ramps on the front chainring. Going to a 1x setup, eliminating the derailleur and eliminating the two chainrings, it changes the gearing a little bit, and I no longer ride in such a position. So it shifts me more to the middle of the cassette. That's fantastic because I'm not sitting there going back and forth constantly between the small ring and the big ring. I also don't have to listen to that chain run along those ramps. In today's video, I'm going to convert my Contend all-road over to a 1x setup. I'm going to show you how to do it as inexpensively as possible and also as easily and quickly as possible. There's really only three things we need to make this conversion. The first is a wide range cassette. This is an 11 to 42 made by Sunrace. The second is a new narrow wide chainring. This is a 40 tooth made by Decus. It's specifically made to fit Shimano's asymmetric cranksets. And the third is one of these road links. So this is a wolf tooth road link. What it does is it shifts the derailleur downward to clear this large 42 cassette. We won't need the front derailleur anymore, so we can completely remove that from the bike. You can remove the front derailleur cable from the shifter and leave the housing. It's easy enough to just snip the housing short. The other option is to remove it completely, but you'll have to rewrap the bars. Depending on what crankset you've got, you'll likely be able to remove the chain rings without pulling the crankset. The rear derailleur needs to come off so we can install the road link. No need to remove the cable, just undo the bolt and pull the derailleur free. When you install the road link, make sure it aligns correctly with the derailleur hanger. This little notch should sit firmly against the derailleur hanger, and the road link should be pretty much up and down when it's tightened down. When tightening down the derailleur, make sure the B tension screw clears the hanger. You'll need a chain whip and a lock ring tool to remove the cassette. This is a Park FR 5.2. The cassette can only go on one way. If you look at the free hub, one of the grooves is wider than the others. That's the one for alignment. Line that groove with the wider tab in the cassette. Slide the new chainring over the crank arm, line it up, and install the new shorter chainring bolts. These chainring bolts are 6 millimeters long. They came with the chainring. After you install the road link, you may need to adjust the derailleur limit screws. With the derailleur in the lowest position or lined up with the smallest sprocket, adjust it so the center of the jockey pulley is slightly to the outside of the smallest sprocket. Do the same for the largest sprocket. Push the derailleur to the outer limit and adjust it so the center of the pulley is slightly to the outside of the largest sprocket. With this new larger cassette, you may need to readjust your cable tension to get it to shift correctly. Run the barrel adjuster all the way in so you've got good slack on the cable. Shift the front shifter to the second position. Then, as you run the crank around so the chain moves, adjust the barrel adjuster until the chain shifts into that second cog. Once you get it to shift into the second sprocket, shift back and forth between the first and second sprockets and adjust the barrel adjuster until it shifts smoothly. It should now shift through all the gears. Run it all the way up, then back down, and adjust the cable tension as needed until you get good shifts. To adjust the B tension screw, shift to the largest sprocket on the cassette. Run the chain around and listen for the sound of the jockey pulley rubbing the sprocket. You want that bead tension screw in the position so that the jockey pulley is as close to the cassette as possible, but without making noise. I've decided to use a chain keeper with this bike. It installs where the front derailleur went, and it ensures that the chain cannot fall off on either side of the chainring. This is important because we're using a derailleur that does not have a clutch. One concern I've noticed, especially with this Shimano 105 5700, it seems like the derailleur spring is not that strong. When you're riding along in the highest gear and you backpedal, or even if you just stop pedaling abruptly, the chain momentum is more than that spring can overcome, and the chain has a tendency to wrap around the cassette. This conversion was really easy. If I wasn't filming it, I could have done it in about 45 minutes. It was also rather cheap. I did the whole thing for about 90 bucks. $45 for the cassette, $25 for the sprocket, and $20 for the road link. All those parts I got new on Amazon. Let's take a quick look at the weights. We did not save much weight at all. By the time you include the chain guide up here, it was pretty much a wash. But let's take a quick look. Out of curiosity to see what the weight difference is between the 1x and the 2x, I've laid the 1x parts that I just showed you on the scale. They come out to 588 grams. So the old stuff, 597 grams. One thing you really shouldn't consider this for is weight savings. The parts I used here really didn't save any weight. I got the bike put back together, I got it tuned, it's shifting really well. I was super excited, so I took it out on today's ride. It snowed last night, so the roads are kind of mucky and it's super cold, so I didn't go very far, only about 20 miles. But 20 miles was enough for me to decide that I really like it. The gear ratio I chose, or the gearing I chose, is spot on. At my average speed and cadence, I'm riding on a slightly higher side of the cassette. Climbing wise, it's 1-to-1, so it climbs just like my road bike does. I was able to hit 42 miles an hour going down Dillon Road. I laid down on the handlebars to get that. The bike spins out and I run out of speed somewhere in the high 30s, somewhere around 38 miles per hour, I think, is 120 RPM. So I couldn't get there on my own, but that's downhill and I had a wind. I'm assuming if you're watching today's video that you are either curious about a 1x setup or you're installing one and you want to know what's involved. So I sure hope that the information I provided you today answered those questions for you. It gave you what you need. So that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you later.